I think for a lot of kids, when they watched Yu-Gi-Oh! GX growing up, they wanted to go to their very own Duelist Academy because the idea of going to school for Yu-Gi-Oh! Sounds really awesome. And what's funny is that for a lot of people, that sort of ended up happening anyway. You know, you go to college and you meet people that play Yu-Gi-Oh! And even though you're not taking actual classes on improving at Yu-Gi-Oh!, you are sort of improving with this new friend group that you met at school. But what if I told you that someone very recently tried to make sort of an online Duelist Academy? That's what I'm reviewing in today's video. So there is a Patreon out there that was released, I think at this point about a month ago, and it's run by some of the best players in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. And the basic idea here, at least as I see it, is the same thing as like piano lessons or saxophone lessons or track lessons. These are ways that you can pay money to talk to some of the best players, some of your coaches out there, and really learn a lot about Yu-Gi-Oh! To take your game to the next level. Now, I know after saying that I will sort of already have some people going, well, who would possibly think about paying someone to get better at Yu-Gi-Oh? But as the Duelist Academy Patreon page explains, it really is for those players that are looking to get that first regional invite or that first regional top or break the YCS bubble. And when I first saw this program, this new Patreon, was when it was first announced on a lot of people's Facebook pages, I was filled with what I'll call skeptical optimism, because I really think the community is lacking something like this, a coaching program. So many other like competitive video games and esports have this, and while Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't a video game or an esport, or at least that's not what this is for, it still is a very competitive card game with a lot of players out there that want to improve. Normal players, your average player, won't really have the opportunity to get a one-on-one coaching session for a couple hours with some of these amazing players in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. It's just not going to happen. Sure, if you randomly get paired against them at a regional or YCS, maybe you can ask them for a few tips after the duel, but in reality, most players just don't have access to these top tier players in normal circumstances. So this gives players that want to improve a way to pay a small or large fee, which we'll get to in a second, and actually get one-on-one coaching with some of the best players out there right now. And I want to make it very, very clear here that I was not paid to promote this Patreon. I will also make it clear here that I did not pay to do this coaching session. I talked to a couple people that were running the Patreon, and because I know them, I said I would like to sort of analyze and review this thing, this brand new thing for my channel, and they said that they wouldn't charge me for it because it was sort of a publicity thing. But I do want to say here, I will be giving my honest opinion. I have some good things to say, I have some bad things to say, mostly good things to say, but I do want to mention a couple improvements, a couple areas where I feel they could do a little bit better in the future if they want this to get even bigger than it is right now. I'm going to talk about the Patreon itself more at the end of the video or later on in the video, because that is where most of my requests for change actually come from. I feel it could be cleaned up a lot, but before we talk about that, I just want to go through what the gist of the actual page looks like so you guys kind of understand where I'm coming from here. There are 5 different support tiers. You have a $1 tier, you have 2 different $10 tiers, you have a $50 tier, and a $75 tier, and I'll post them all on the screen right now. The $1 tier is just for supporting people that are running it. I don't think a lot of people are doing that. I think most of the people that are just going on here actually want to be coached. The $10 tier gives you access to all the Patreon content that they post, all the Patreon exclusive content that they post. That's pretty cool. The other $10 tier lets them sort of coach you on one replay that you send them. So that's like the lowest level of coaching. They have a $50 tier, which is a 2-hour coaching session. You can sort of work with them to figure out a schedule, and you can have them look at replays and work on your deck list. That's a solid 2 hours of sort of content that you get from this for $50, so $25 an hour. And then the final tier is $75 per month, and what's really important about this one is that you get an extra hour of coaching, yes, but the most important part, at least to me, is that you get to pick which coach you want. Now, I'll say right now that a lot of people have their own favorite players, and I do believe, if you look at the coaching list, that all these players are very well known in the community to most competitive players. They all have tons of credentials, so don't necessarily think that you want to always pick your specific coach. If you don't have that extra $25, maybe you don't care so much about that top level, but personally I care about that a lot, and mostly because, just sort of eliminating some of my bias here, it's because I didn't want to get a coach that I was already currently friends with or acquaintances with, because I didn't want to have that sort of affect my analysis of how good or bad the coaching was. So what I got, and I think this is more my fault because I got sick right when I was sort of doing this coaching, I got somewhere in between the $50 and $75 tier, because I only did 2 hours because I missed a lot of days because I was sick, but I did actually get a chance to pick my coach coach, and I picked one of my favorite players in the game, Asala. I'm sure you guys have seen many of his topping profiles. He's played so many cool decks, so many innovations. He's part of one of the best circles in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now with Aaron Furman and Jesse Cotton, so he is one of the players that I look up to the most, and while I do respect him a lot, I don't really know him that well in real life. I've talked to him a couple times, but mostly he's just someone that I really look up to and I really want to get the chance to talk to, which I feel for many of you guys out there, that's exactly what this is going to do. You're getting a chance to talk to someone that you admire and you want advice from. So how did the coaching itself go? Well, I can say a lot of things, and I will say a lot of things, but the basic summary is that it surpassed all of my expectations in pretty much every single way possible. I had so much fun. I learned so much information. It truly really felt worth the money, which I know sounds dumb because I didn't pay any money, but I think if I was someone that was trying to take myself to the next level, which I am, I mean, I took it really seriously. I took it as seriously as possible. I was trying to get advice on my YCS Pasadena list, which he gave me a ton of feedback on. If I was someone that was willing to take myself to the next level just by paying $50 or $75 once a month, this really would be a very valuable resource. And there are a lot of you out there that maybe don't have the extra cash. Maybe you just do the $10 sort of coaching, just looking at a replay. That's still very valuable. But the main thing that I wanted to do was look at my deck list. So I had my sort of concept deck list for YCS Pasadena, and what Asala did is he was very smart about this. He didn't just right off the bat start listing cards that I should change. That's not how he did it. We went through and he said, what are your successes with this deck? What are your problems that you've been having with this deck? What is like the biggest thing that you're worried about for Pasadena? And I listed a lot of things. The biggest thing at the time with the current deck list that I was looking at was that I basically had no out other than preemptively like stopping it to the IP Masquerena play. Before IP Masquerena, all the Orcus players were mostly just ending on Crescendo, but when that card came out, suddenly the ending board really changed. And one of the ways that it changed is that people could suddenly end on the IP and then a Symbol Skeleton or a Harp Horror Engrave. And against me, that simply allowed them to make Trisbania and banish all of my back row in the main phase 2, which was really, really tough for me to overcome. Some other issues that I mentioned was dealing with rogue matchups. You know, a lot of the side deck cards that I was playing or that I was thinking about playing were really only good against expected metagame matchups, so I wanted some cards that were good against rogue decks, and especially I talked about that the Pendulum matchup is almost unwinnable, like virtually impossible to win if they open even a little bit playable, or if I lose the die roll, I lose almost every single time. So those were some of the biggest issues I was having, and Asala pointed out some really cool cards, really cool techs that I could play. One of them, which I've talked about in my deck profile from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Day at that event, was Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, which really did cover pretty much every single issue I just said. It completely rips apart the IP opening because you just ogre the IP. You can even draw it as your 6th card. You can even draw it off Extravagance for your 7th or 8th card. It is just so powerful, and at that tournament I did it so many times, and it was extremely, extremely good every single time I drew the Ogre against the Orcus combo, because you could just hit the IP every single time, and then they just were out of interruptions if they didn't set the Crescendo. Furthermore, the Ghost Ogre was really good against Pendulums, as well as a lot of rogue matchups, and it had some really cool specific applications that I never would have thought of. One of the ones that I mentioned in that profile, I mentioned a lot of them, but one of them that I mentioned that I want to sort of highlight is that if you activate a monster effect while your opponent has an Appaloosa on the board and they use the Appaloosa effect, you can actually Ghost Ogre the Appaloosa, and then because it can't lose attack, it actually doesn't negate your monster's ability. That is one of the coolest things that I never would have thought of in a million years outside of this coaching session, and that really, I mean, I don't want to center him here. It's not all about just these one card tech choices, but that whole back and forth conversation where Asala and I were talking about Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit was so valuable to me, and that alone, which happened in like the first 20 minutes of a 2-hour session, was almost worth the price tag just entirely. The other big specific suggestion was playing evenly matched in the main instead of Imperial Order and Solemn Warning. So what Asala was talking about, he looked at my deck list and he said, okay, I like this a lot because almost every single trap card is good going second. You know, I'm not playing a lot of Floodgates in the main besides the Order, and all the trap cards, you know, the Compulse, the Strike, the Lost Winds, the Protocols, all the Altergeist cards, all of these cards are really good going second. Even the Judgment is pretty good for stopping Crescendo or stopping like a big play your opponent tries to do. But there were 2 cards, Solemn Warning and Imperial Order, that were in the main deck that basically do nothing going second, and that really does hurt because Altergeist should win most of the time that they're able to go first and open a playable hand. So Asala suggested, he said, this might sound crazy, but what if you main decked Evenly Match instead of those 2 cards? And what he kind of taught me about, and I thought about this last year as well when I played Evenly Match at YCS Chicago, which I bubbled unfortunately, but I played Evenly Match in the main deck for that event too, because what Asala sort of explained to me is that when you're playing a deck like Altergeist that obviously really struggles going second, more so than the other decks out there, especially the meta decks out there. You really want to have like high variance cards in your deck for the when you go second, because you're always or almost always going to win going first. So instead of playing the last two cards in the deck, playing cards that are only good going first, I opted, because of a solid suggestion, to play cards that are only good going second, because if you draw evenly matched going first, the other four cards in your hand will probably be good enough to sort of carry that game. In reality, that absolutely happened. I mean, when I played at the tournament, I opened evenly going first a couple times, never mattered, I won every single one of those games, but going second, I just can't even explain to you guys how much of a blowout it was time and time again. There were some truly insane boards that I broke with the evenly match. He even pointed out that like the big combo deck, the Danger Thunder deck with the Star Legion, all those cards, that whole deck actually doesn't end on any cards that can negate an evenly match, because it ends on the Heretic Seal and Appaloosa, and it ends on Harbinger, and it ends on Colossus. None of those cards can negate evenly match, so you can just do evenly match even if you don't draw any hand traps up until that point. You can just evenly match and then stop their entire field. It is completely broken against that deck, which a lot of people were expecting to be a popular deck at the event. And what was cool as we went through and worked on the deck list more and more is that he didn't just tell me to make these changes, because after all, it is my deck list, but he gave so many suggestions. And what was really cool was that he would go through and he would have me come up with the solutions. He would tell me some suggestions, but a good example is like we went back and forth on Inspector Border and Summon Limit, and he basically just asked me what are the matchups that Summon Limit is good against and what are the matchups that Inspector Border is good against, what cards do these cards actually work against a lot, and why would you play one over the other? What are some of the downsides of them? And the downside of Inspector Border is that it's pretty bad against decks like Pendulums, and even Lunalight Orcus can push through it a lot of times, where with Summon Limit those decks can't. But the downside of Summon Limit is that it gets hit by Cosmic Cyclone and Red Reboot and cards like that. And he really just had me come to my own conclusions, but with having a testing partner there to sort of brainstorm with me. We spent most of the time looking at a deck list, because I don't really have a lot of replays saved on Dueling Network, but I did remember that the night before I had streamed and I had one game that I really thought was winnable, but I just didn't go back and look at it. And then we went back and looked at it, and like, yes, game one that I totally threw definitely was winnable in a few different ways, and he kind of helped me out the step-by-step process, sort of analyzing what were some of the decisions that I could have made. I mean, obviously now that I have perfect information, because I know what cards my opponent had, like then I should know how to play around it. But what Asala was showing me, because he didn't have perfect information, that there's certainly worse steps that I could have taken in the first and second turn that would have made the game go a lot differently, and that helped me out a lot at the tournament as well. Now, of course, I did not top YCS Pasadena. That happens. There's always going to be variance, but I felt like I took many of the skills from that coaching session and applied them to games, not just with the tech choices, but the actual plays themselves, which was really useful, especially if I was going to do this long term. So I think the summary here is that it definitely is worth the money. I mean, I know not everyone can afford every card even, so spending $50 or $75 might sound like a lot just for a coaching session, but it really was so much more valuable than I even imagined, and I imagined it'd be pretty darn valuable, but it really did surpass my expectations. Even if you don't have that $50 or $75, maybe even just the $10 a month one to do a replay analysis would be super valuable to the average player. I think if you're someone that's really struggling to get that first regional top or top that first YCS or get out of that bubble, I think this is like by far one of the most valuable resources that you have out there right now. Asala was super willing to work with my schedule, especially considering that I got sick for 3 or 4 days and I still wanted to fit this in before YCS Pasadena. And during the actual session, he never made me feel pressured to end the session early or anything along those lines. I think at one point I asked, are we allowed to keep talking? Is that fine? And he said, I just want to talk until you know that you're comfortable with your choices, and that's perfectly fine. And that was really cool. I never felt like, oh, I'm running out the clock, anything along those lines, playing for time or whatever. He just made me feel very comfortable and sort of like an open brainstorming discussion with any testing partner. But now we're like, what, 15 minutes in the video, and you guys are saying, I thought you said you had some bad things to say as well. And I do. And I just want to make it very clear here that the stuff that I'm mentioning is mostly minor. The coaching session itself was perfect. It really was. I think I made that very clear. I think it is worth the money. The actual Patreon page itself, though, could use an editor and use a couple of changes. So I say the first thing, it could use an editor, and I say that because I am an English major. You guys probably know that by now. I graduated with an English degree, so there are a lot of grammatical mistakes or just weird grammatical choices throughout the post. A lot of the titles aren't capitalized properly. A lot of the sentences just like end halfway through. There are a lot of fragments, and I think that it could really just use like one person that knows a little bit about like writing and stuff to actually go through and just quickly edit it, I think that could be super valuable, because while the grammar isn't like the most important thing in deciding if whether or not someone actually wants to support this Patreon, I still think it's very important, because right now I think they're sort of riding on the star power of all the duelists that are in the Patreon, which is perfectly fine, but I think that they want to appeal, or at least in my opinion, if you're trying to make it as big as possible, you want to try to appeal to people that maybe don't know every single duelist on that list. And one of the ways that you can do that is by having a professional looking Patreon, and certainly it has gotten better. I will say that, because I remember looking at this thing like in the first hour that it was uploaded and it was a complete mess. So clearly someone actually has gone through and edited a lot of it, but I do have to give my honest feedback here and say it is kind of still not nearly as polished as it should be. In other words, while the product itself, the coaching that I did was super valuable, I think that the Patreon itself, the presentation, could use a little bit of a cleanup going forward. Now they don't have to do this. I think that the star power will get them pretty far, and especially because the session itself was so valuable. Right now they almost are making $1,000 per month, and that's really awesome, really impressive. I think it just goes to show how good the product is, but I think someone should go through and just maybe clean it up a little bit. It's possible that it's completely fine the way it is, but as an English major, as someone that does this kind of stuff, I really think that it would look a little bit better if it was just polished a tiny bit just to make it more presentable. I also think that the names of the actual tiers could use some work. I think calling the $10 per month coaching poor man's coaching, while funny, is not very good. In the terms of someone reading this for like the very first time, they're like, oh, I can't afford the $50 per month, I'll go to the next lowest one. They see that the coaching is actually calling them a poor person, and while it is sort of a joke and it's sort of in a funny way, I think some people could be very turned off from that title. I know that I personally was when I first opened this Patreon. I think that calling your people that are donating money to you $10, I think calling them poor is not really the greatest idea, even if it is meant in like a funny way. Personally, if I was renaming all of the tier levels, I would start with like Coach Soldier Wolfbark and then Coach Captain Bearman. There's a couple of those I think could be kind of funny. I think Coach Goblin at the $50 mark is pretty cool. I don't know if I'd keep it at that one or lower it or whatever, but I think that some sort of way to incorporate all Yu-Gi-Oh cards that say coach in their title would be a pretty cool way to make this Patreon a little more themed. I also think that the content tier makes zero sense, and I think that it's just the accidental situation that has happened from people setting this up. So basically the problem here is that all of the posts on the Patreon right now, they're all locked unless you are paying for the content tier or higher. The problem here is that because the content tier is the exact same price as the poor man's coaching, it means if you buy the poor man's coaching, you can see all of the content as well. The content tier definitely should just be $5 a month, because at the moment you have two different $10 tiers. With one of them you can see the content, and with the other one you can see the content and also get your replay analyzed. I think it's pretty clear here, and I wonder, I can't see it on the Patreon page, but I wonder if anyone's actually part of the content tier and doesn't realize that the poor man's coaching unlocks that stuff as well. I'm not even sure if you can change that in the Patreon settings. You certainly can change it for dollar amounts, but I don't know about actual tiers. So I think realistically the content tier should be a $5 tier, not a $10 tier, especially because all the people doing the other $10 tier can just see that content anyways. I want to make a quick note here that they actually updated this. So if you go to the Patreon right now and look at their recent posts, you actually can't read every single post, even if you have the poor man's coaching. So they did make that change. Objectively, I still feel like the content tier should just be $5. I don't know exactly how many people have signed up for that tier, but I really think that it's only worth the $5 compared to the rest of the content. As for the actual content being posted on the Patreon for that content tier and for the other tiers, it seems like they had slowed down for a little bit. There was like nothing posted for a couple weeks, but it seems like it's picked up a little bit. I will say that in general, from the Patreons that I've noticed, keeping up on that Patreon exclusive content is really hard for Yu-Gi-Oh players specifically. I've seen so many Patreons, myself included, back when I had one like 2 years ago. It's really hard to find the time and find the energy to actually post stuff specifically to Patreon. I think it's more likely to work in this situation than any other situation, because there's so many people involved with this one Patreon that as long as like one person posts something every couple of months, eventually that'll sort of flesh out to where there's something being posted like every single week. So I think it has a higher chance of working. But I would say to the people that are working on this Patreon, you really want to make sure that you are posting content to there, because especially right now where the content tier is the same price as the coaching that can also see the content, I mean, definitely the people that are paying $10 only for that content, maybe they don't realize that the poor man's coaching unlocks that content as well. they're probably going to want to make sure that they're getting their money's worth. But even if it's $5 per month, I mean, I know that sounds insignificant compared to like the $50 and the $75, but all those little sort of Patreons really add up in terms of if you have like 100 people at $5 each, that's $500. That's a really good price. So you want to make sure that you're actually posting things on the Patreon. Right now at the beginning, it seems to be going pretty well, but just if this is like a long-term thing, that's one thing that I would keep in mind. So what's the final verdict here? Well, the final verdict, in my opinion, is that this Patreon is an excellent idea and is being executed almost flawlessly in terms of the coaching session itself. And while it could use a little bit of a cleanup, a little bit of editing on the Patreon page overall, I think in general, this is a fantastic idea, and I'm really happy to see that they're taking it seriously. I talked with Asala a little bit through Facebook as well as in the actual session about the future of it. It seems like they're willing to work with people that are budget players, people that are playing rogue decks, people that are playing meta decks. All sorts of players out there will have all sorts of questions and concerns, and I think that overall these coaches are really willing to work with whatever player is actually talking to them. I want to give a huge shout out to the Duelist Academy for letting me do this for free so I can review it in a video. It really would be something that I would be comfortable paying for going into the future. I think it was super valuable, and I'm really happy that someone is taking it this seriously. Overall, I'll put a link in the description below for you guys to check it out, because I really do recommend it for those aspiring competitive players or currently competitive players that are looking to top. I think that this idea in general is super awesome to see. We really have been missing something like this in the community. I've seen a couple other coaching sessions in the past from other YouTubers, but in general, they were way less competitive and a little bit more overpriced, if you can believe it, than these ones are. I think that the $10 replay option is a super great option for budget players that are just looking to get a little bit of help. And then if they find it super valuable, like I did, they can maybe take it to the next level to the $50 or $75 tier if they want to talk to specific people. Anyway, though, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.